we're moving up through 2004. We're into 2008, and the Bush administration is talking about letting in. I think you mentioned this, Daniel. Letting in Ukraine and Georgia, but it's too controversial. So there's like some type of like compromise where we're going to talk about the idea in a sort of a general way. There's not going to be any type of like conditions or this and that, but like, it's like, we want to let you in type of thing. And that's where we've been, until this, summit, although obviously Russia attacks. Where are you guys on the scale of Russia attacked Ukraine because of NATO encroachment, or Russia attacked Ukraine because of domestic issues, etc.?
I mean, I land much more on the domestic issue side, I guess, if you're talking about immediate causes of the invasion. You know, I don't think that there's anything NATO could have done in January of last year or February of last year that would have prevented this from happening. So if that's the time frame, and I know this is a heated debate between the folks who think that NATO expansion played a role here and the folks who reject that out of hand. But I think if you go back further than that and you look over a course of a couple of decades at NATO expansion and NATO's relationship and the U.S. relationship with Russia, and the mounting sense of kind of grievance and marginalization that was felt, 2008 was a big one. And I think, Sam, as you mentioned, it was sort of the worst thing that you could do at that point, was to say, we vaguely want to let you guys into NATO, but we're not going to say when. We're not going to say what the conditions would be.
What's the best way for us to piss off everybody?
Yeah, we're just going to leave it hanging out here like this. It was just a really incredibly boneheaded decision across all fronts, and one that, as we now know, William Burns, who's the current director of the CIA under the Biden administration, was ambassador to Russia, said this is going to lead to a war, or it may very well lead to a war, because this is so antagonistic to the Russians that they're going to have a difficult time kind of.
And we should say he said this to Condi Rice. He worked for Condi Rice, who was ostensibly a Russian expert, and she didn't buy it, or she didn't get anywhere in the administration, in the Bush administration, to push that. But it did lead to a war, it seems to me, in 2014, right? I mean, in one fashion or another. And the Obama administration, as far as I can tell, basically said, like, we're going to be more or less hands off on this, because maybe in some, sort of vague acknowledgement that, like, moves maybe by the Bush administration in particular, and, over the years, may have like created these tensions, and we need to release this tension or some level. Is that a fairly accurate description?
I would even add it contributed to the war in Georgia in 2008. So we don't even have to go to 2014 to see that this was an antagonistic thing. Sorry, Danny, I know you were gonna jump in there.
No, I think that's precisely right with Obama. Particularly second term, Obama became quote unquote more realist, where he really did try to connect U.S. foreign policy to perceived national interests, and it just is very, very difficult to do when you're talking about Ukraine and Crimea, except if you're talking in basically expansive moral terms, or in this sort of vague, used when they want to and not used when they don't want to, idea of democracies versus autocracies. So Obama didn't want to make this a centerpiece of U.S. foreign policy, though, Derek, there was involvement since 2014 in the U.S. You might be able to talk about a bit better than I.
Well, yeah, there's been there's been training. NATO trainers have been in Ukraine. There've been, not excuse me, not obviously on the level that we've seen over the last year and a half, but there's been military hardware that's been brought in to support the Ukrainians. I mean, people, may not necessarily understand that this was a frozen conflict for 8 years in the Donbass with a hardened battle line and shelling almost, if not on a daily basis, then fairly frequently. And there were certainly NATO trainers that came in to help the Ukrainians to support the Ukrainian military, and there was other involvement on a lower level than certainly we've seen since the invasion began.
And so this is the tension of U.S. foreign policy. Even if you want to disengage, you can't quite. There's always a low-level hum of involvement, which just exposes the imperial nature of the U.S. state.
Okay, and so we're up to the most recent meeting of NATO. We have now NATO has now welcomed Finland, and Sweden is soon to join. Now that is wrapped up,
and Finland notably a border state with Russia, which I feel like was hugely important to note. Yeah,
and fought with Russia in the last century a bunch of times. Yeah.
It feels like Putin miscalculated. Maybe the biggest understatement I could utter.
There's
right
no
now.
question.
I mean, if the agenda was, I can't imagine what any other agenda would be at this point. It miscalculated. He miscalculated both in terms of from a tactical and a strategic, regardless of whether it was external security or domestic. He just really blew it in a big way. It feels like.
I think it's a COVID war. I mean, I think he basically became increasingly isolated over COVID, and he became increasingly paranoid. And it's such an obviously terrible decision in every way, shape, or form. Before the war, neither Derek and I thought he would do it because it was so obviously a bad choice, a very difficult thing to accomplish. So he did everything that he didn't want to do. Most important, I wrote a piece for the Alameda Institute where I basically just read and analyzed everything that the U.S. has done. I mean, this has been a gift to the American empire. This has been a gift to getting European nations to recommit themselves to U.S. hegemony in Europe. This has been a gift to people who want the United States to remain forever armed and militarized and dominant abroad. So I think it's you can't even overstate how much of a failure this is from Putin's perspective, to say nothing of the domestic political costs, which are kind of difficult to really analyze, but clearly fairly significant, especially as Putin gets on in years, even though he's significantly younger than President Joe Biden and Donald Trump.
Well, but Danny, I agree with that, and I think it's not just a COVID war; it's a legacy war. It's somebody who recognizes, and I know there's Kremlinology about Putin's health all the time, and that's kind of nonsense. But he is getting older. He's in the second of what's supposed to be a 2-term presidency. He'll undoubtedly find a way to stick around, but legally, at least, that's the way it sits. And Ukraine is Ukraine in Russian history and the Russian imagination. This is a core land, and Putin saw it kind of slipping out of that orbit, and I think didn't want his legacy to be losing Ukraine, if you want to put it that way.